The woman mopping the floors at Fort Blackstone had no idea that in 3 hours, she would be standing face to face with a general who would call her the most dangerous person on the entire base. What started as casual curiosity about a cleaning lady's unusual habit would uncover a secret so classified that most people didn't even know it existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning fog rolled across Fort Blackstone's main courtyard as Elena Vasquez pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway of Building C at 28. She had been working as a night shift janitor for 8 months, and she had perfected the art of being completely invisible. Her small frame moved silently through the corridors, black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the standard gray uniform that made her blend into the background like a shadow. Elena preferred the night shift because it meant fewer people to avoid, fewer questions to deflect, and fewer chances for anyone to notice the small details that might give away more than she intended. She cleaned the administrative offices, the briefing rooms, and the training facilities with methodical precision, always finishing her routes exactly on schedule. Most of the base personnel barely acknowledged her existence. To them, she was just another face in the support staff, someone who kept their workspaces clean, but wasn't worth remembering. The few who did interact with her found her polite but distant, professional but never personal. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and disappeared into the background as soon as conversations ended. Elena had structured her entire routine around maintaining this anonymity. She arrived for her shift at 11 p.m. when most of the base was settling down for the night. She worked her way through the building systematically, cleaning offices and common areas while their occupants were either asleep or off duty. By 7 a.m., when the day shift began arriving, she would be finishing up in the remote storage areas where she was least likely to encounter anyone. The routine suited her perfectly. She could do her job efficiently without drawing attention, earn enough to cover her modest needs, and avoid the kind of scrutiny that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her background. For 8 months, this system had worked flawlessly. This particular morning, however, something was different. Elena was finishing her usual route through the administrative wing when she heard voices coming from the conference room at the end of the hall. It was unusual for anyone to be in the building this early, but she figured it was probably an early meeting or some kind of emergency briefing. She continued with her work, planning to clean that area later when it was empty. But as she moved closer to restock the supply closet nearby, she could hear the conversation more clearly. What she heard made her stop completely. "The security breach happened 3 days ago," someone was saying. "Someone accessed classified files from Terminal 7 without proper authorization. We're talking about highly sensitive intelligence data." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She recognized the tone and urgency in the speaker's voice. This wasn't routine administrative business. This was a security investigation. "Do we have any suspects?" asked another voice. "We're working through the list of personnel who had access to that terminal. The problem is, whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for and how to cover their tracks. This wasn't random browsing. This was professional." Elena moved her cleaning cart slightly closer to the door, using the motion as cover. While she listened, 8 months of careful invisibility had trained her to gather information without appearing to do so. "What kind of files were accessed?" the first voice asked. "Personnel records, training schedules, equipment inventories, but also some of the classified operational data from the Northern Border Initiative. If that information gets into the wrong hands, it could compromise ongoing missions." The Northern Border Initiative. Elena knew that program. She knew it better than almost anyone in the building, but that knowledge was supposed to be buried so deep that even she sometimes tried to forget it existed. "Sir, A third voice joined the conversation. "We've reviewed the security footage from Terminal 7. The interesting thing is, the breach happened during the night shift, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the building should have been empty, except for cleaning staff." Elena's hand tightened on the handle of her cleaning cart. She forced herself to continue her work normally, but her mind was racing. A security breach during the night shift meant they would be looking at everyone who had access to the building during those hours. That meant they would be looking at her. "Cleaning staff," the first voice repeated thoughtfully. "How thoroughly are they vetted?" "Standard background checks for support personnel. Nothing too extensive since they don't have access to classified materials." Elena almost smiled at that. Standard background checks. If only they knew how inadequate those checks were for someone who knew how to create the right kind of paper. "Trail. I want a complete review of everyone who was in this building during the time window," the voice continued. "Staff, security, maintenance, cleaning personnel, everyone." "Yes, sir. Should we start with the most likely suspects?" "Start with everyone. Sometimes the least likely person is exactly who you're looking for." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena finished restocking the supply closet and moved her cart away from the conference room. She had heard enough to know that her comfortable anonymity was about to become a problem. A security investigation meant questions, background checks, and the kind of attention she had spent 8 months avoiding. As she continued down the hallway, Elena's mind was already working through possibilities. She could request a schedule change to avoid being on base during the investigation. She could call in sick for a few days and hope the whole thing blew over. She could even quit and find work somewhere else, though that would mean starting over, again with a new identity and a new set of carefully constructed lies. But as she reached the end of the hallway, Elena realized that running might not be an option this time. If they were conducting a thorough investigation, disappearing suddenly would only make her look more suspicious. And if they dug deep enough into her background, they might find inconsistencies that would lead to even more uncomfortable questions. She was still considering her options when she heard footsteps behind her. Elena turned to see a young lieutenant approaching, probably heading to the conference room she had just passed. "Excuse me," the lieutenant said. "You're the night cleaning staff, right?" "Yes, sir," Elena replied, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I was wondering if you noticed anything unusual in the administrative wing over the past few nights. Any people who shouldn't have been there, any doors left unlocked, anything out of the ordinary." Elena looked at Morrison carefully. He was young, probably fresh out of officer training, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he was taking his first security investigation very seriously. "Nothing unusual that I noticed," she said. "I clean the same areas every night, same routine. And you would notice if someone was in the building who shouldn't be there." "I would notice," Elena said simply. Morrison nodded and made a note on his clipboard. "What's your name for the record?" "Elena Vasquez." "How long have you been working here, Ms. Vasquez?" 8 months. And before that? Elena felt the familiar calculation running through her mind. How much truth could she tell without revealing too much? How many lies could she layer together without creating contradictions that might surface later? "I worked cleaning services in different places. Office buildings mostly. Here in the area, I moved here from California. Needed a fresh start." Morrison wrote down her responses, but Elena could see that he was also studying her face, trying to read something in her expression. She had encountered this kind of scrutiny before, and she knew how to handle it. The key was to be helpful without being too helpful, cooperative without being too eager. "Ms. Vasquez, you're here every night during the week, right? You must know this building pretty well." I know where everything is, yes, including the computer terminals. Elena felt a slight shift in the conversation. Morrison was no longer just gathering routine information. He was probing. I clean around them. I don't use them. But you would know which ones are typically left on, which ones people forget to log out of, that kind of thing. I clean them. I don't pay attention to what's on the screens. Morrison studied her for another moment, then nodded. Thank you for your time, Ms. Vasquez. Someone might follow up with you later as part of the investigation. Of course, Elena said. I want to help however I can. As Morrison walked away toward the conference room, Elena continued with her cleaning routine. But her mind was no longer focused on her work. She was thinking about security investigations, about the kinds of questions that might come next, and about whether 8 months of careful invisibility was about to come to an end. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years learning to hide in plain sight, to blend into backgrounds and avoid detection. But now, the very skills that had made her invisible might be the ones that made her the most obvious suspect in a security breach she had nothing to do with. Elena finished her shift that morning with the same methodical efficiency she always maintained, but she knew that everything had changed. The comfortable routine that had protected her for 8 months was about to be disrupted by the kind of attention she had spent years learning to avoid. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the base, Elena found herself wondering if her past was finally catching up with her. And more importantly, whether the person she had been before becoming a janitor was about to become impossible to hide. The morning sun was beginning to rise over Fort Blackstone as Elena walked toward the main gate. In a few hours, the investigation would continue, more questions would be asked, and more attention would be focused on the night shift personnel who had access to the building during the security breach. Elena Vasquez, night shift janitor, was about to discover that sometimes the safest place to hide was also the most dangerous place to be found. Elena arrived at her small apartment that morning knowing that sleep would be impossible. The conversation she had overheard, the questions from Lieutenant Morrison, and the growing security investigation had triggered responses she thought she had buried 8 months ago. Her hands moved automatically through her post-shift routine, but her mind was calculating risks and probabilities with the kind of precision that came from years of training most people never received. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, looking out at the ordinary suburban street where she had built her ordinary civilian life. The neighbors who occasionally waved at her had no idea that the quiet woman in apartment 3B was analyzing their security investigation from inside, identifying weaknesses in their procedures and spotting opportunities they would never recognize. Elena had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous part of any mission wasn't the action itself. It was the waiting afterward, when you had to live with the consequences of decisions made in seconds, but which would affect everything that followed. Right now she was in that waiting period, and every choice she made in the next few hours could determine whether her carefully constructed new life survived or collapsed completely. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the cleaning company. The message was routine, asking about supply needs for the following week, but Elena found herself studying it for hidden meanings that probably weren't there. 8 months of paranoia had taught her to look for threats in every communication, patterns in every coincidence. She responded to the text normally, then spent the next 2 hours researching everything she could find about the security breach at Fort Blackstone. The official reports were minimal, but Elena knew how to read between the lines of military press releases. Someone had accessed classified information with enough skill to avoid immediate detection, but not enough skill to avoid leaving traces that would eventually be discovered. Elena could think of at least 12 different ways the breach could have been executed, and probably 20 ways it could have been done better. That kind of thinking was exactly what she was trying to avoid, but the analytical skills that had once been her greatest asset were also the hardest habits to break. By noon, Elena had made her decision. She would continue her normal routine, answer any questions that came her way, and avoid doing anything that might draw additional attention. Running would only confirm suspicions that might not even exist yet. The best way to handle scrutiny was to be exactly what she appeared to be, a janitor who cleaned buildings and went home to her quiet apartment. That evening, Elena arrived, for her shift to find the atmosphere on base noticeably different. Security personnel were more visible, additional checkpoints had been established, and the casual conversations she occasionally overheard had been replaced by the kind of professional tension that accompanied serious investigations. She signed in at the security desk as usual, but noticed that the guard paid more attention to her identification than normal. He studied her face, checked her badge twice, and made a note on his logbook that hadn't been there before. "Evening, Ms. Vasquez," the guard said. His tone was polite but formal. "Just to let you know, there might be some additional security personnel in the buildings tonight. Part of the ongoing investigation." "Of course," Elena replied. "Should I adjust my cleaning schedule to avoid interfering?" "No, just continue your normal routine. If anyone has questions, answer them honestly and completely." Elena nodded and collected her cleaning supplies, but she could feel the guard's eyes following her as she walked toward Building C. The comfortable invisibility she had maintained for 8 months was definitely gone, replaced by the kind of attention that made every movement feel significant. As she began her usual route through the administrative wing, Elena noticed details she had trained herself to ignore. The placement of security cameras, the locations of motion sensors, the gaps in surveillance coverage that someone with the right knowledge might exploit. She forced herself to focus on her cleaning tasks, but the observational skills that had once kept her alive were operating automatically. Elena was vacuuming the main corridor when she heard voices approaching. She continued her work using the noise of the vacuum cleaner as cover while she listened to the conversation. "The background check on the cleaning staff came back clean," someone was saying. "Nothing suspicious in any of their files." "That doesn't mean anything," another voice replied. "A professional would know how to create clean documentation." Elena recognized the second voice as Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer who had questioned her that morning. The first voice belonged to someone older, probably his superior. "You think one of the cleaning staff is responsible?" Morrison asked. "I think we need to look at everyone who had access, regardless of how unlikely they seem. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The conversation was moving in exactly the direction she had hoped it wouldn't. "What about the woman I interviewed this morning? Elena Vasquez. What about her?" Something felt off about her responses. Not dishonest exactly, but like she was being very careful about what she said. Elena continued vacuuming, but every word of the conversation was being recorded in her memory with perfect clarity. "Careful how?" She answered my questions directly, but she didn't volunteer any additional information. Most people in her situation would be more talkative, more eager to help. She was almost too professional. The older voice was quiet for a moment. "Too professional for a janitor." "Maybe, or maybe I'm reading too much into it. Trust your instincts, Morrison." If something felt wrong, it probably was. "What else did you learn about her?" "She's been here 8 months. Moved from California. Says she worked cleaning services before, but she was vague about the details." "Vague how?" "No specific company names, no references, no detailed employment history. Just general statements about office cleaning." Elena realized she was gripping the vacuum cleaner handle tighter than necessary. Morrison was more observant than she had given him credit for, and his questions were heading toward areas she had hoped to avoid. "Run a deeper background check," the older voice said. "Look into her employment history in California. Check for any gaps or inconsistencies, Yes, sir. Should we increase surveillance on her? Not yet. We don't want to spook her if she is involved, but keep her on the list of persons of interest. Elena finished vacuuming the corridor and moved to the next area on her route, but her mind was working through implications. A deeper background check would uncover carefully constructed documentation that would satisfy most investigators, but it would also create records of the investigation itself. And if someone was persistent enough, they might find inconsistencies. That would lead to uncomfortable questions. She was cleaning the break room when she encountered another person she hadn't expected to see. Staff Sergeant Chun from the security office was sitting at one of the tables, reading reports and drinking coffee. He looked up when Elena entered. "Miss Vasquez, right?" "I'm Sergeant Chun. Mind if I ask you a few questions while you work?" Elena continued cleaning while they talked, using the activity to mask her body language and give herself time to think before responding. "Of course, Sergeant. How can I help?" "I'm trying to understand the security protocols for night shift personnel. How do you access the buildings you clean?" "I have a master key for the cleaning areas and common spaces. I don't have access to private offices or restricted areas. And Terminal 7? Do you clean around the computer stations?" Elena paused in her cleaning, not because she was surprised by the question, but because she needed to appear like someone who was trying to remember details rather than someone who had perfect recall of every security camera and access point. "In the building. Yes, I clean that area. Usually around 2 a.m. when I'm working on the administrative wing." "Do you remember cleaning there 3 nights ago? The night of the security breach. I clean there every night. I don't remember anything unusual about that particular night." Shun made notes while she talked, but Elena could see that he was also watching her movements, studying the efficient way she handled her cleaning tasks. "You're very thorough," he observed. "How long have you been doing cleaning work?" Elena felt the conversation shifting into territory she had prepared for, but hoped to avoid. "Several years. I started in California." "What made you move to this area?" "Personal reasons. I needed a fresh start after some difficult circumstances." Chun nodded sympathetically. "Family issues? Something like that." Elena finished cleaning the break room and prepared to move on to the next area, but Chun continued the conversation. "Ms. Vasquez, can I ask you something off the record?" Elena looked at him carefully. "Of course. You seem very professional for someone in your position. Very organized, very precise. Have you ever worked in security or administration?" The question hit exactly where Elena had known it would eventually land. Shun had spotted the same inconsistency that Morrison had noticed. She was too competent, too professional, too precise for someone whose job was supposed to be invisible and routine. "I've always been organized," she said simply. "It helps me do my job efficiently. I'm sure it does. But there's something about the way you move, the way you observe your surroundings. It reminds me of people with security training." Elena met his eyes directly. "I pay attention to my environment because I work alone at night in large buildings. It's a safety issue." Chun studied her for another moment, then nodded. "That makes sense. Thank you for your time, Ms. Vasquez." As Elena left the break room, she realized that her situation was deteriorating faster than she had anticipated. 2 different investigators had now noticed the same inconsistency. She was too professional, too observant, too precise for her supposed background. The very skills that made her good at her job were also making her stand out in ways she couldn't afford. Elena finished her shift that morning with the knowledge that her time at Fort Blackstone was probably coming to an end. The investigation was closing in, not because she had made any mistakes, but because being competent at her job had made her look suspicious to people trained to spot anomalies. As she walked toward the main gate, Elena found herself thinking about the irony of her situation. She had spent years learning to blend into backgrounds, to be invisible and unremarkable. But when she finally found a job where those skills were supposed to be assets, they had become liabilities that threatened to expose everything she was trying to hide. The morning sun was rising over Fort Blackstone as Elena reached her car. In a few hours, investigators would be making phone calls to California, running deeper background checks, and asking questions that would eventually lead them to conclusions she wasn't ready for them to reach. Elena Vasquez, night shift janitor, was about to learn that sometimes being too good at your job was the most dangerous mistake you could make. Elena spent the next 2 days living in a state of calculated tension. She maintained her normal routine perfectly, arriving for her shifts on time, cleaning with the same methodical efficiency, and responding to questions with the same careful professionalism. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for the moment when her carefully constructed life would finally collapse. The deeper background check that Lieutenant Morrison had requested was probably already underway. Elena had built her civilian identity with enough layers of documentation to satisfy routine investigations, but persistent digging would eventually uncover inconsistencies that would raise more serious questions. She estimated she had perhaps a week before someone started asking questions she couldn't answer without revealing truths that were supposed to remain buried forever. On Wednesday night, Elena arrived at Fort Blackstone to find the security presence even more intense than before. Additional guards had been posted at checkpoints, random bag searches were being conducted, and the casual atmosphere that had characterized the night shift had been replaced by the kind of heightened alertness that accompanied serious security concerns. Elena signed in at the main gate and noticed that her name was now highlighted on the security roster. The guard checked her identification more carefully than usual, made several notations on his logbook, and radioed her arrival to go. Someone else on the base. Ms. Vasquez, the guard said as she prepared to collect her cleaning supplies. Major Reynolds from base security would like to speak with you before you begin your shift tonight. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course, where should I meet him? Conference room A in the administration building. He's waiting for you now. Elena walked toward the administrative building with the same steady pace she maintained during her normal routine, but her mind was racing through possibilities. A request to speak with major-level security personnel meant the investigation had escalated beyond routine questioning. They either had specific suspicions about her involvement, or they had discovered something in her background that required clarification. Conference room A was the same room where she had overheard the first discussion about the security breach. Elena knocked on the door and entered to find Major Reynolds sitting at the conference table with several folders spread out in front of him. He was a compact man in his 40s with the kind of intense focus that came from years of security work. Ms. Vasquez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Elena sat across from him and noticed that one of the folders was significantly thicker than the others. That folder probably contained her background information, and the thickness suggested they had been very thorough in their research. I'm Major Reynolds, head of base security. I'd like to ask you some follow-up questions about the security breach investigation. Of course, Major. I want to help however I can. Reynolds opened the thick folder and studied the contents for a moment before looking back at Elena. We've been reviewing your employment history, Ms. Vasquez. I have to say, there are some interesting gaps in your documentation. Elena had prepared for this moment, but hearing it stated directly still created a familiar tightness in her chest. What kind of gaps? Your employment records in California are rather sparse. The cleaning company you listed as your last employer has no record of anyone named Elena Vasquez working for them during the time period you specified. Elena maintained eye contact while her mind calculated responses. The documentation she had created was designed to withstand routine verification, but not the kind of detailed investigation that a major security breach would generate. That's strange, she said. Maybe there was a paperwork issue. I worked for them through a staffing agency, so maybe the records are under a different system. What was the name of the staffing agency? Elena provided a name that corresponded to real documentation she had prepared, knowing that any verification would lead to carefully constructed, but ultimately false information. Reynolds made notes and continued reviewing the folder. There's another issue. Ms. Vasquez, your social security number shows employment gaps that don't match the timeline you provided when you were hired here. Elena felt the investigation closing in around her like a carefully designed trap. Every answer she gave would either contradict previous statements or lead to new questions that would be even harder to answer. I had some periods of unemployment, she said. Personal issues that made it difficult to maintain steady work. What kind of personal issues? Elena paused, knowing that her next response would determine how much deeper this conversation would go. She could continue building layers of lies, hoping to create enough confusion to buy time. Or she could shift the conversation in a direction that might actually help her situation. Major Reynolds, can I ask you something? Reynolds looked surprised by the question. Go ahead. How long have you been investigating this security breach? Several days. Why? And how close are you to identifying the person responsible? Reynolds studied her carefully. That's not really something I can discuss with you, Ms. Vasquez. Elena leaned forward slightly. The person who accessed those files knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to find it. They understood the security protocols well enough to avoid immediate detection, but they made small mistakes that eventually led to discovery. That suggests someone with partial training, not professional experience. Reynolds was now looking at her with complete attention. What makes you say that? Because a professional would have known that accessing files during the night shift would eventually focus suspicion on support personnel. A professional would have found a way to access the information during regular hours when there would be more potential suspects. You seem to know quite a bit about security procedures for someone who cleans buildings. Elena realized she had reached the moment where careful lies would no longer be sufficient. She could continue pretending to be nothing more than an observant janitor, or she could reveal enough truth to change the direction of the investigation entirely. Major Reynolds, what if I told you that the person you're looking for isn't someone who works on this base? What do you mean? What if the security breach was conducted by someone from outside who used the night shift cleaning schedule as cover? Someone who knew when the buildings would be minimally staffed, but didn't understand that night shift personnel would eventually become suspects? Reynolds closed the folder and gave Elena his complete attention. You're suggesting the breach was conducted by an outsider who used your work schedule as operational cover? I'm suggesting that you might be investigating the wrong people. Ms. Vasquez, you seem to have very sophisticated insights into security procedures and criminal methodology. Where does that knowledge come from? Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save her cover or destroy it completely. Major Reynolds, what do you know about the Crimson Valley operations? The change in Reynolds' expression was immediate and dramatic. His casual investigative demeanor disappeared, replaced by the kind of sharp attention that suggested Elena had just mentioned something that carried significant weight. Where did you hear that name? I didn't hear it anywhere, Major. I lived it. Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face with new intensity. Ms. Vasquez, I think we need to continue this conversation with some additional personnel present. Elena nodded. I think that would be appropriate. 20 minutes later, Elena found herself in a different conference room with Major Reynolds and two other officers she hadn't met before. One was introduced as Colonel Martinez from Intelligence, and the other was Captain Foster from Special Operations. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely from a routine security investigation to something that felt much more serious. Ms. Vasquez, Colonel Martinez began, Major Reynolds tells me you mentioned the Crimson Valley operations. That's not information that's widely available. No, sir, it's not. How do you know about Crimson Valley? Elena looked around the room at the three officers, all of whom were now treating her as something other than a janitor, who might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was operational commander for the final phase of Crimson Valley. Code designation Viper 7. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see the officers exchanging glances that carried meanings she could only guess at. Viper 7 was killed in action during the extraction, Captain Foster said quietly. That was in the official reports. Viper 7 was declared. Killed in action, Elena corrected. There's a difference. Colonel Martinez opened a new folder that he had brought with him. The Crimson Valley operations were classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people knew the operational details. I know the details because I planned most of them. Prove it. Elena spent the next hour providing information that only someone with intimate knowledge of Crimson Valley could have known. Operational codes, personnel designations, tactical decisions that had never been included in official reports. With each detail she provided, the atmosphere in the room changed further. Ms. Vasquez, Colonel Martinez finally said, or should I say Commander Vasquez, we need to understand why you're working as a janitor on a military base under an assumed identity. After Crimson Valley was shut down, the participants were given new identities and civilian placements. I was supposed to disappear completely, which I did. Elena Vasquez is who I became when Viper 7 was officially declared dead. But why here? Why Fort Blackstone? Elena considered how much truth she could reveal. Because sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight. And because after years of operations, I wanted to do something normal for a while. Major Reynolds looked confused. So you had nothing to do with the security breach? Nothing at all. But I recognized the methodology, and I knew it wasn't professional work. What do you mean? Elena stood up and moved to the whiteboard in the conference room. The person who accessed those files made 3 critical mistakes that a trained operative would never make. She began drawing a timeline on the board, marking the access points and security gaps that the investigation had identified. First, they accessed the files during a time window that would inevitably focus suspicion on night shift personnel. A professional would have found a way to access the information during regular hours when there would be hundreds of potential suspects. She marked additional points on the timeline. Second, they accessed files in a pattern that created a clear trail through the system. A professional would have randomized their access points to avoid creating obvious patterns. Elena added more details to her diagram. Third, they spent too much time in the system. They were browsing, trying to find information, rather than going directly to specific files. That suggests someone who had partial knowledge but not complete access credentials. Colonel Martinez was taking notes while Elena spoke. You're suggesting this was industrial espionage rather than foreign intelligence? I'm suggesting this was someone with enough inside knowledge to access the system, but not enough training to do it professionally. Probably a contractor or former employee with legitimate grievances. Elena spent the next 30 minutes walking the officers through a complete analysis of the security breach, identifying investigative approaches they hadn't considered, and highlighting evidence they had overlooked. Her insights were precise, professional, and completely accurate. Commander, Captain Foster said when she finished, we've been investigating this breach for a week and made minimal progress. You've just provided more useful analysis in 30 minutes than our entire team has developed. You were investigating the wrong people using the wrong methodology, Elena replied. You were looking for an insider threat when you should have been looking for an outsider with inside knowledge. Colonel Martinez closed his folder and looked directly at Elena. Commander Vasquez, we have a proposition for you. Elena felt a familiar sensation, the moment when mission parameters were about to change completely. We need your help to solve this security breach. But more than that, we need your expertise to prevent future breaches. Your insights tonight have shown us gaps in our security procedures that we didn't even know existed. Elena returned to her seat, knowing that her comfortable anonymity as a janitor was about to end permanently. What are you suggesting, Colonel? We're suggesting that Elena Vasquez, night shift janitor, might be ready to become something more useful. As Elena looked around the room at the three officers who now knew her real identity, she realized that her 8 months of peaceful invisibility were over. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Blackstone, she felt like she might be about to do work that actually mattered. The most dangerous woman on base was about to stop hiding in plain sight. Elena walked out of the conference room that night knowing that her life had just changed completely. The comfortable routine of pushing a cleaning cart through empty hallways was over, replaced by something she hadn't expected to want again: the opportunity to use her real skills for a mission that mattered. Colonel Martinez had given her 24 hours to consider their offer, but Elena already knew her answer. The next morning, Elena sat in her apartment, looking at 2 different versions of her future. She could decline the colonel's offer and try to maintain her civilian life, probably relocating again and starting over with another carefully constructed identity. Or she could accept the position they had offered: special security consultant, working directly with base intelligence to identify and prevent security threats. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 8 months trying to escape her past, only to discover that her past was exactly what the base needed to solve their current problems. The skills she had tried to bury were the same skills that could help protect the people and information that mattered. Elena made her decision and called Colonel Martinez. "Colonel, this is Elena Vasquez. I accept your offer." "Excellent. Can you be here at 1400 hours for briefings?" "Yes, sir. And Commander?" "You can leave the cleaning cart at home." Elena arrived at Fort Blackstone that afternoon wearing civilian clothes instead of her gray janitor's uniform, but she noticed that people looked at her differently now. Word had apparently spread among the senior staff that the quiet cleaning woman was someone whose background carried significant weight. She was no longer invisible, but she was visible in a way that felt purposeful rather than threatening. The briefing session took place in a secure conference room with Colonel Martinez, Major Reynolds, and Captain Foster. They had assembled files on the security breach investigation, current threat assessments, and several other security concerns that had been developing over the past few months. "Commander," Colonel Martinez began, "we've followed your analysis of the security breach. You were correct about the methodology and the likely source. We've identified a former contractor named David Chun who had access to our systems 18 months ago and was terminated for security violations." Elena reviewed the file they handed her. "Have you located him?" "We have. He's been selling information to competitors of defense contractors who work with our base. Industrial espionage, just as you predicted." "What about the security vulnerabilities that allowed him access?" Major Reynolds opened another folder. "That's where we need your help. Chun exploited gaps in our systems that we didn't even know existed. We need someone with your background to conduct a complete security assessment and recommend improvements." Elena spent the next hour reviewing their current security protocols and identifying weaknesses that a trained operative would recognize immediately. The base had excellent physical security and good personnel screening, but their electronic systems had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge. "Your main problem isn't technology," Elena explained as she finished her review. "Your main problem is that you're defending against conventional threats while ignoring unconventional approaches." "What do you mean?" Captain Foster asked. Elena moved to the whiteboard and began drawing a diagram of the base's security structure. "Your systems are designed to stop direct attacks, unauthorized access attempts, and standard infiltration methods. But you're not prepared for someone who uses legitimate access as cover for illegitimate activities. She marked several points on her diagram where security gaps existed. Chun succeeded because he didn't break into your systems. He used legitimate access credentials and trusted connections to gather information slowly over time. By the time you noticed the pattern, he had already extracted what he needed. Colonel Martinez studied the diagram. How do we defend against that kind of approach? You need to think like the threats you're trying to stop. You need someone who understands unconventional methodology to design defenses against unconventional attacks. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon walking the officers through a comprehensive security assessment that identified dozens of potential vulnerabilities they hadn't considered. Her analysis was thorough, practical, and immediately actionable. "Commander," Colonel Martinez said as the briefing concluded, "this is exactly the kind of thinking we need. When can you start full-time?" "I already have, Colonel." Over the next 2 weeks, Elena threw herself into her new role with an intensity that surprised even her. She conducted security assessments, developed new protocols, and trained personnel to recognize threats they had never been taught to identify. The work was challenging, meaningful, and utilized skills she had thought she would never use again. But the most rewarding part of her new position came when she began working directly with the junior officers and enlisted personnel, who were responsible for implementing security procedures. Many of them had never encountered someone with Elena's background, and they were eager to learn from her experience. "Ma'am," Sergeant Williams from the communications section asked during one of her training sessions, "how do you learn to think like someone who's trying to break into our systems?" Elena considered the question carefully. "You start by understanding that most security threats aren't random. They're planned by people who study your procedures, identify your weaknesses, and develop strategies to exploit them. To defend effectively, you need to understand how that planning process works." She led the group through a series of exercises designed to help them think from an adversary's perspective. How would they gather intelligence about base operations? What information would they need to plan an infiltration? What vulnerabilities would they look for in security procedures? "The key," Elena explained, "is to realize that security isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding why the rules exist and recognizing when someone might try to work around them." Sergeant Williams raised her hand. "Ma'am, you make it sound like security is more about psychology than technology." "That's exactly right. Technology can be hacked, but psychology can be manipulated. Understanding human behavior is often more important than understanding computer systems." Elena spent the following weeks developing training programs that taught base personnel to recognize social engineering attempts, identify unusual behavior patterns, and respond appropriately to security concerns they might not have been trained to handle. The response from the base personnel was overwhelmingly positive. They were learning skills that made them more effective at their jobs, while gaining insights into security, thinking that most military training didn't provide. "Commander Vasquez," Lieutenant Morrison approached her after one of her training sessions. Elena recognized him as the young officer who had first questioned her during the security breach investigation. "Lieutenant Morrison, how can I help you?" "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for how I handled the investigation when you were working as cleaning staff. I should have recognized that there was more to you than your job title suggested." Elena smiled. "Lieutenant, you did exactly what you were trained to do. You noticed inconsistencies and asked follow-up questions. That's good investigative work. But I made assumptions based on appearances. Everyone makes assumptions based on appearances. The important thing is being willing to adjust those assumptions when you get new information." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, can I ask you something about your previous work?" Elena had been expecting this question. Her background was now known to the senior staff, but the details remained classified. What would you like to know? How do you learn to see threats that other people miss? How do you develop that kind of situational awareness? Elena appreciated the question because it focused on skills rather than classified operations. You start by understanding that most people see what they expect to see. They notice things that fit their preconceptions and overlook things that don't. Effective security awareness means training yourself to notice the things that don't fit. She led Morrison through a practical exercise, asking him to observe the break room they were standing in and identify anything unusual or out of place. "I don't see anything suspicious," Morrison said after a few minutes. Elena pointed to several details he had missed: a window that had been left unlocked, a computer terminal that someone had forgotten to log out of, and a maintenance access panel that wasn't properly secured. "None of these things are necessarily threats," Elena explained, "but they represent opportunities that someone with malicious intent could exploit." Effective security awareness means noticing these opportunities before anyone can take advantage of them. Morrison studied the details Elena had pointed out. "I was looking for obvious problems, but these are subtle issues that could become bigger problems." Exactly. Most security breaches don't start with dramatic actions. They start with small oversights that accumulate over time. Elena spent the next hour teaching Morrison techniques for developing better observational skills and security awareness. The conversation was practical, focused, and immediately applicable to his work. As Morrison left, Elena reflected on how much she was enjoying the teaching aspect of her new role. For years, her knowledge had been compartmentalized and classified, useful only for specific operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Now she was able to share practical skills that would help people be more effective at their jobs, while contributing to overall base security. The following month brought an unexpected opportunity that would test Elena's new role in ways she hadn't anticipated. Colonel Martinez called her into his office for a meeting that would prove to be another turning point in her evolving mission. "Commander," Colonel Martinez began, "we've received a request from Fort Harrison for assistance with a security training program. They've heard about the work you're doing here and want to implement similar training at their facility." Elena was intrigued. "What kind of assistance are they requesting?" "They want you to conduct a 2-week assessment of their security procedures and develop a training program for their personnel. It would be your first assignment as a traveling consultant." Elena realized that her work at Fort Blackstone was about to expand beyond anything she had imagined when she first accepted the position. "Colonel, I'm honored by the request. When would they need me to begin?" "Next month." "But Commander, there's something else you should know. Fort Harrison is where the Northern Border Initiative operations were originally planned. Some of the personnel there might recognize your previous work." Elena felt a familiar sensation. The moment when past and present were about to intersect in ways she couldn't completely control. "Are you concerned about security implications?" "I'm concerned about your readiness to work in an environment where your background might be more widely known." Elena considered the question carefully. For 8 months, she had been invisible. For the past month, she had been visible but only to a small group of people who understood the need for discretion. Working at Fort Harrison would mean operating in an environment where her reputation might precede her. "Colonel, I think I'm ready for that level of visibility. Are you sure? Once your background becomes more widely known, there's no going back to anonymity." Elena looked out the window at Fort Blackstone, where she had spent 8 months learning to hide and 1 month learning to be useful again. "Colonel, I've spent enough time hiding. If my background can help other people do their jobs better and keep military installations more secure, then I think it's time to put that background to work." Colonel Martinez smiled. "In that case, Commander, you have a new mission." As Elena left the colonel's office, she realized that her journey from invisible janitor to security consultant was about to take another significant step forward. The skills that had once been buried in classified operations were becoming tools for teaching and protecting others. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in front of a conference room full of officers at Fort Harrison, introducing herself not as a former janitor who had stumbled into security work, but as a specialist whose background qualified her to help them think about threats in ways they had never considered. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she began, "and I'm here to teach you that the most dangerous threats are often the ones hiding in plain sight." As she looked around the room at the officers who would be learning from her experience, Elena realized that her years of operational work had found their true purpose, not in the classified missions that would never be acknowledged, but in the knowledge she could pass on to others who would use it to protect people and information that mattered. The most dangerous woman on base was no longer hiding. She was teaching others to see the dangers that most people missed, to think like the threats they needed to stop, and to transform hard-earned experience into practical skills that would make a difference in the real world. Elena Vasquez had finally found a mission worthy of everything she had learned in the shadows. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after her first assignment at Fort Harrison, Elena found herself standing in the Pentagon briefing room, facing a panel of senior military officials who had gathered to hear about something unprecedented in modern military training. The woman who had once pushed a cleaning cart through empty hallways was now presenting security innovations that were being implemented across multiple installations nationwide. "Commander Vasquez," General Patricia Hayes began, "your training programs have reduced security incidents by 60% at the installations where they've been implemented. We need to understand how you're achieving these results." Elena looked around the room at the assembled officers, many of whom carried enough rank and responsibility to make decisions that affected thousands of personnel. 6 months ago, she had been invisible to people like this. Now they were asking her to explain how she had transformed military security thinking. "General, the key isn't teaching people new information. It's teaching them to use information they already have in ways they hadn't considered." Elena moved to the presentation screen and displayed a map showing the locations where her training programs had been implemented. Each location was marked with data showing security improvements, incident reductions, and personnel performance metrics. Traditional security training focuses on responding to threats after they've been identified. My programs teach personnel to recognize threats before they become incidents. General Hayes studied the data. "Can you give us a specific example?" Elena highlighted Fort Meridian on her map. 3 months ago, Fort Meridian was experiencing a pattern of equipment theft that had stumped their security investigators. Small items were disappearing from supply areas, but there was no evidence of break-ins or unauthorized access. She clicked to the next slide, showing security camera footage and access logs. "I spent 2 days at Fort Meridian teaching their personnel to think like thieves rather than like victims. Within a week, they had identified the problem, a delivery driver who was using legitimate access to shipping areas to steal items during routine deliveries." Colonel Martinez, who had accompanied Elena to the Pentagon, added context to her explanation. The theft had been going on for 8 months before Commander Vasquez's training helped them solve it in 1 week. "How did you teach them to see what they had been missing?" asked Admiral Thompson from Naval Intelligence. Elena appreciated the question because it got to the heart of what made her approach different from conventional training. "I taught them to map the intersection of opportunity, access, and motivation. The delivery driver had opportunity because he was alone in supply areas. He had access because his deliveries were routine and expected. He had motivation because he knew which items had resale value and wouldn't be immediately missed." Elena displayed a diagram showing how these 3 factors created vulnerability points that could be identified and monitored. Once the personnel understood this framework, they started noticing patterns they had been overlooking. The same items disappearing on the same delivery days, conducted by the same driver who always requested to work alone. General Hayes was taking notes while Elena spoke. "Commander, this approach seems to require a fundamental shift in how security personnel think about their responsibilities." "Yes, ma'am. Instead of waiting for problems to occur and then investigating them, we teach people to identify conditions that could lead to problems and address them proactively." Elena spent the next hour walking the panel through case studies from different installations where her training had helped prevent security incidents, reduce vulnerabilities, and improve overall operational effectiveness. Each example demonstrated how teaching personnel to think strategically about security had produced measurable improvements. "Commander Vasquez," General Hayes said as the presentation concluded, "we'd like to discuss expanding your program nationally. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" Elena felt the familiar sensation of mission parameters expanding beyond anything she had originally imagined. When she had accepted the position at Fort Blackstone, she had thought she was helping one base solve one security problem. Now she was being asked to transform security, thinking across the entire military. "General, I believe the principles we've developed can be scaled effectively, but it would require training additional instructors and developing standardized curricula. What would you need to make that happen?" Elena had been thinking about this possibility for months, developing plans for expansion that would maintain the effectiveness of her approach while reaching larger numbers of personnel. "I would need authorization to establish a training center, recruit and train qualified instructors, and develop comprehensive materials that could be implemented consistently across different installations." Admiral Thompson leaned forward. "Commander, let me ask you something directly. Why does this approach work when conventional security training has limitations?" Elena considered the question carefully. It touched on fundamental differences between her background and traditional military security training. "Admiral, conventional security training teaches people to follow procedures and respond to specific scenarios. My approach teaches people to understand the psychology behind security threats and develop adaptive thinking skills." She moved to a clean section of the whiteboard and began drawing a comparison chart. Traditional training asks, "What should you do if someone tries to access a restricted area without authorization?" My training asks, "What would motivate someone to attempt unauthorized access, and how can you recognize those motivations before they become actions?" Elena filled in details on both sides of her comparison, showing how strategic thinking about security created different outcomes than procedural compliance. The difference is that procedural training prepares people for specific situations, while strategic training prepares them for unexpected situations that require adaptive responses. General Hayes studied the comparison Elena had drawn. "You're teaching people to think like threats in order to defend against them more effectively." "Exactly. And once people understand how threats develop and operate, they become much better at recognizing and preventing them." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Elena answering detailed questions about implementation, costs, personnel requirements, and expected outcomes. By the end of the session, she had received provisional approval to develop a national training program that would be piloted at 12 installations over the following year. As Elena left the Pentagon that afternoon, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 1 year ago, she had been an invisible janitor trying to avoid attention. Now she was developing security training that would influence military thinking nationwide. But the most meaningful validation of her work came 3 weeks later, when she received an unexpected phone call from Sergeant Williams at Fort Blackstone. "Commander Vasquez, this is Sergeant Williams. From Communications, I wanted to thank you for something." Elena remembered Williams from her early training sessions, a young sergeant who had been particularly interested in learning about threat recognition. "Of course, Sergeant. How can I help you?" "Ma'am, yesterday I prevented what could have been a serious security incident because of the training you gave us." Elena felt the satisfaction that came from knowing her work had made a practical difference in a real situation. "Tell me what happened." "I was working late in the communications center when I noticed someone in civilian clothes, accessing computer terminals in the adjacent office area. Everything about the situation seemed normal, but something felt wrong." Elena could hear the excitement in William's voice as she described applying the training Elena had provided. "I remembered what you taught us about recognizing patterns that don't fit expectations. This person had legitimate access credentials and seemed to know what they were doing, but they were accessing terminals in a sequence that didn't match normal work patterns. What did you do?" "I observed for a few more minutes and realized they were accessing personnel files for people they shouldn't have had any reason to research. I contacted security, and it turned out to be an unauthorized background investigation being conducted by someone with a personal grudge." Elena smiled, recognizing the successful application of principles she had taught about recognizing subtle indicators of unusual behavior. "Sergeant, that's exactly the kind of thinking that prevents small problems from becoming major security incidents. How do you feel about your ability to recognize potential threats now?" "Ma'am, I feel like I understand my job completely differently. Instead of just following procedures, I feel like I'm actively protecting the base and the people who work here." Elena spent a few more minutes discussing the incident with Williams, helping her understand how her quick thinking had potentially prevented identity theft, harassment, or other serious consequences. As the conversation ended, Elena realized that this phone call represented everything she had hoped to achieve when she first accepted the position at Fort Blackstone. She wasn't just teaching people new skills. She was helping them understand their work as meaningful contribution to something larger than themselves. Over the following months, Elena received similar calls from personnel at installations where she had conducted training. Stories of prevented thefts, identified security vulnerabilities, and stopped potential incidents. Each story represented someone who had learned to see their environment differently and take action to protect their colleagues and their mission. The national training program was approved for full implementation after the pilot phase exceeded all projected outcomes. Elena found herself traveling constantly, establishing training centers, developing instructional materials, and preparing other instructors to carry on the work she had started. But the most rewarding moment came during a return visit to Fort Blackstone, where her journey had begun. Elena was conducting an advanced training session for personnel who had completed her basic programs and wanted to develop more sophisticated threat recognition skills. During a break in the training, Lieutenant Morrison approached her. He had been promoted to captain since their first encounter during the security breach investigation. "Commander, I wanted to tell you something. Last month, my unit was deployed to provide security for a diplomatic facility overseas. We encountered situations that weren't covered in any standard training manual." Elena listened as Morrison described complex security challenges that required adaptive thinking and strategic analysis. "Ma'am, the training you provided gave U.S. frameworks for analyzing threats and developing responses, even when we were dealing with completely unfamiliar situations. We were able to identify and neutralize several potential security problems because we understood how to think strategically about protection." Morrison paused, collecting his thoughts. "Commander, you didn't just teach us about security. You taught us how to think like professionals who take responsibility for protecting others. That's changed how I approach every aspect of my job." Elena felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond any official recognition or career advancement. Morrison and hundreds of other personnel like him were now thinking strategically about security, taking initiative to prevent problems and understanding their work as meaningful contribution to missions that mattered. That evening, Elena walked through the same corridors where she had once pushed a cleaning cart, trying to remain invisible. Now she moved through those same hallways as someone whose work was making a measurable difference in military effectiveness and personnel safety. The small office where she had once stored cleaning supplies had been converted into a conference room, where her training materials were displayed and her methodologies were being studied by security professionals from around the world. As Elena prepared to leave Fort Blackstone for her next assignment, she stopped at the security desk where she had once signed in as a night shift janitor. The same guard who had checked her identification 8 months ago was still working there. "Evening, Commander," he said with a smile. "Hard to believe you used to clean these buildings." Elena smiled back. "I'm still cleaning these buildings, Sergeant. I'm just cleaning up different kinds of problems now." As she walked toward her car, Elena reflected on the transformation that had begun with a security investigation and evolved into a mission that was influencing military thinking nationwide. The skills that had once been buried in classified operations were now being used to teach others how to protect the people and missions they cared about. Elena Vasquez had discovered that the most dangerous woman on base wasn't someone who threatened security. She was someone who taught others to see threats clearly, think strategically about protection, and take responsibility for preventing problems before they could harm anyone. The woman who had once hidden in plain sight was now helping others see what had been hidden from them. And in teaching others to recognize dangers, she had found the most meaningful mission of her entire career. 2 years after establishing the National Security Training Program, Elena received a phone call that would challenge everything she had built and force her to confront the most dangerous mission of her career. The call came from General Patricia Hayes, but the tone was different from their previous conversations about program expansion and training metrics. "Commander Vasquez, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. How quickly can you get to Washington?" Elena was at the training center she had established in Colorado, working with a group of instructors who were preparing to deploy to overseas installations. The urgency in General Hayes' voice suggested something far more serious than routine. "Program administration." "I can be there tomorrow morning, General. What's the nature of the situation?" "We'll discuss details when you arrive. Report to the Pentagon at 0800 hours. And Commander, this conversation never happened." Elena recognized the tone and the protocol. This wasn't about training programs or security consulting. This was about operational work that required the skills she had developed before becoming Elena Vasquez. The flight to Washington gave Elena time to consider what kind of situation would require her specific background and expertise. Her training programs had been successful, but they were designed for conventional security threats. If General Hayes was calling her personally with classified urgency, they were dealing with something that went beyond normal military security concerns. Elena arrived at the Pentagon the next morning to find herself escorted to a secure briefing room she had never seen before. General Hayes was there, along with several other senior officers she didn't recognize and 2 civilians who had the unmistakable bearing of intelligence professionals. "Commander Vasquez, thank you for coming on short notice. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels." Elena nodded, understanding that she was about to receive information that would probably change everything about her current mission. 3 weeks ago, we discovered that someone has been systematically accessing classified information from multiple military installations. Not random browsing, but targeted intelligence gathering that suggests detailed knowledge of our security procedures. General Hayes activated a display screen showing a map of the United States with dozens of military installations marked in red. The access pattern suggests someone with intimate knowledge of military security protocols, advanced technical skills, and the ability to operate undetected across multiple locations. Elena studied the map, noting the geographic distribution and the types of installations that had been targeted. "General, the pattern suggests coordination between multiple operators, or a single operator with extensive resources and mobility. That's our assessment as well. But there's something else that makes this particularly concerning. General Hayes highlighted specific installations on the map. Several of these facilities have implemented your security training programs. The breaches occurred at installations where personnel should have been better prepared to detect this kind of activity. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Someone was specifically targeting installations where her training had been implemented, suggesting they either knew about her programs or were testing them deliberately. General, are you suggesting that my training programs are being used to identify vulnerabilities rather than prevent them? We're suggesting that someone understands your methodology well enough to work around it. And that level of understanding suggests either inside knowledge or professional analysis of your techniques. One of the civilians, who had introduced himself as Director Collins from an intelligence agency Elena didn't recognize, opened a folder and spread photographs across the conference table. Commander, we'd like you to look at these surveillance images and tell us if you recognize anything significant. Elena examined the photographs, which showed various people in different locations at several of the targeted installations. The images were taken from security cameras and showed individuals who appeared to be conducting routine business at each location. The people in these photographs were present at multiple targeted installations during the time periods when breaches occurred. Director Collins explained, "We believe they're part of a coordinated intelligence operation." Elena continued studying the images, looking for patterns or details that might provide insight into the operation they were dealing with. Director, these people don't look like conventional intelligence operatives. They look like support personnel, contractors, maintenance workers. Exactly. They're using the same kind of invisibility strategy that you employed when you were working as cleaning staff, hiding in plain sight among routine personnel. Elena realized why she had been called to Washington. They weren't just dealing with a security breach. They were dealing with an operation that mirrored her own background and methodology. General, you want me to help identify and stop operatives who are using techniques similar to my own background. Commander, we want you to lead the investigation. You understand this methodology better than anyone else we could assign to the case. Elena felt the familiar sensation of mission parameters shifting, but this time the change felt more significant than any transition she had experienced since leaving operational work. What kind of resources would I have? Complete authority to investigate across all affected installations, access to any personnel or information you need, and a team of specialists who understand the sensitivity of this operation. Elena considered the implications of accepting this assignment. Leading an investigation would mean returning to the kind of work she had thought she had left behind permanently. It would also mean potentially confronting operatives whose skills and training might be similar to her own. General, if I accept this assignment, I need complete operational autonomy. No interference from local commanders, no restrictions on investigative methods, and no predetermined conclusions about what we might find. Agreed. This operation has national security implications that go beyond normal military security concerns. Elena accepted the assignment and spent the next week being briefed on details that painted a picture of sophistication and coordination that impressed even her experienced perspective. The intelligence operation they were investigating had been planned and executed with professional expertise that suggested state-level resources and training. Her first stop was Fort Carson in Colorado, where one of the most significant breaches had occurred. Elena arrived at the installation not as a training consultant, but as an investigator with authority that superseded normal command structures. Commander Vasquez, Colonel Davidson from Fort Carson's intelligence section, greeted her. "We've prepared a complete briefing on the security incident that occurred here." Elena reviewed the files they provided, but she was more interested in conducting her own analysis than relying on conclusions that others had reached. "Colonel, I'd like to interview the personnel who were on duty during the breach. But I'd also like to speak with people who might have noticed details that didn't seem significant at the time." Elena spent 3 days at Fort Carson talking to security guards, administrative personnel, maintenance workers, and anyone else who might have observed unusual activity during the time frame of the breach. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. Several people remembered seeing the same individual in different areas of the base over the course of several days. Someone who had legitimate reasons to be in each location, but whose presence created a pattern that became suspicious only when viewed comprehensively. "Sergeant Murphy," Elena said to one of the security guards she interviewed, "you mentioned seeing the same maintenance contractor in multiple buildings over a 3-day period. What made you notice that?" "Ma'am, it wasn't anything obvious. But I remember thinking it was unusual for one person to have work orders in so many different areas. Most contractors specialize in specific systems." Elena had Murphy walk her through the exact locations and times where he had seen the contractor, mapping out a route that provided access to virtually every sensitive area on the base. "Sergeant, did you verify his credentials or work orders?" "I checked his identification, and it was legitimate. But I didn't verify the specific work orders because he seemed to know what he was doing and had proper access badges." Elena realized that the operatives they were dealing with understood military psychology well enough to exploit the tendency of security personnel to focus on credentials rather than behavior patterns. "Sergeant Murphy, based on what you observed, do you think this person was actually performing maintenance work?" Murphy considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, ma'am, I never actually saw him working on any equipment. I just saw him moving between locations with tools and documentation." Elena spent the rest of her time at Fort Carson developing a profile of the operation they were investigating. The operatives were using legitimate contractor credentials to gain access, creating plausible reasons to be in sensitive areas, and gathering intelligence through observation rather than direct system access. But what impressed Elena most was the sophistication of their operational security. They had avoided creating obvious patterns that would trigger conventional security alerts while gathering comprehensive intelligence about base operations and personnel. Elena's next assignment took her to Fort Stewart in Georgia, where she encountered something that made the investigation personal in ways she hadn't expected. While reviewing security footage from the time period of the breach, she recognized someone in the surveillance images. The face was older and the hair was different, but Elena knew she was looking at Marcus Chun, a former operative from the Crimson Valley operations who had supposedly been killed in action during the same mission, where Elena had been declared dead. Elena stared at the surveillance image for several minutes, processing implications that went far beyond the current investigation. If Marcus was alive and involved in intelligence operations against military installations, it meant that other members of Crimson Valley might also be alive and operating under assumed identities. But it also meant that Elena's own background might be known to the people she was investigating, creating security concerns that could compromise not just the current mission, but her entire carefully constructed civilian identity. Elena called Director Collins from a secure line that evening. "Director, I've identified one of the operatives involved in the Fort Stewart breach. But the identification creates complications for the investigation." "What kind of complications?" "The operative is someone from my own background. Someone who supposedly died during the same mission where I was declared killed in action." Elena could hear the significance of this information registering in Director Collins' voice. "Commander, are you suggesting that this intelligence operation is being conducted by former American operatives?" "I'm suggesting that at least one of the operatives has the same background I do, which means they know techniques that aren't taught in conventional intelligence training. And they might know about your current identity and mission." That's a possibility we have to consider. Director Collins was quiet for several moments. Commander, this changes the scope of the investigation significantly. If we're dealing with former American operatives, we need to understand their motivations and objectives. Elena spent the night thinking about Marcus Chen and the implications of his involvement in the intelligence operation. She had worked with Marcus during several Crimson Valley missions, and she knew his capabilities were similar to her own. If he was leading or participating in operations against American military installations, there had to be compelling reasons. That went beyond simple espionage or financial motivation. The next morning, Elena made a decision that would define the rest of the investigation. Instead of reporting Marcus's location to her superiors for immediate apprehension, she decided to make contact with him directly. Elena knew that conventional law enforcement approaches would be ineffective against someone with Marcus's training and experience. But she also knew that if Marcus was operating against American installations, there might be factors driving his actions that weren't apparent from external investigation. Elena spent 2 days conducting surveillance of her own, tracking Marcus's movements and identifying patterns in his operational behavior. What she discovered was troubling in ways that went beyond the immediate security concerns. Marcus wasn't just gathering intelligence about military installations. He was specifically targeting information about personnel who had backgrounds similar to Elena's own. He was looking for former operatives who had been given civilian identities after classified operations were shut down. Elena realized that the intelligence operation they were investigating wasn't about military secrets or foreign espionage. It was about finding people like herself, former operatives who had been declared dead but were living under assumed identities in civilian roles. But the most disturbing possibility was that Marcus might be hunting these former operatives for reasons that had nothing to do with gathering intelligence. He might be eliminating people who posed potential security risks to operations or organizations that were supposed to remain buried forever. Elena faced a choice that would determine not just the outcome of her current investigation, but the safety of unknown numbers of former operatives who were living quiet civilian lives under identities they believed were secure. She could report her findings to her superiors and let conventional law enforcement handle the situation. Or she could confront Marcus directly, using her own operational skills to discover his true objectives and protect the people he might be targeting. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had spent 2 years teaching others to recognize and prevent security threats, was about to face the most dangerous threat of her own career. And this time, the threat came from someone who knew exactly who she really was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.